It's time for Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott, inviting the atheist, agnostic, and skeptic to examine for themselves the evidence for the Christian faith. We are all limited by what we do not know and by the things we think we know but are not true. Dr. Joe Mott earned his PhD at LSU and was a distinguished math professor at Florida State University for 38 years, helping to write 3 math textbooks and authoring over 30 research articles in math. He is now the host of this radio program, Defending and Commending the Faith. Here is Joe Mott.
Hello to everyone. Welcome to the program. Followers of Christ are still being called into action for defending and commending the Christian faith. At the end of the last episode, we were attempting to date when the 4 Gospels were written. We had discussed J. Warner Wallace's 4 points that he used as a homicide detective in Los Angeles to determine if a witness to a crime was credible. The initial step in his journey from being a hardened atheist toward Christianity was what he thought was an evaluation of the Gospels. The first criterion of eyewitness credibility requires one to know that the witness was present in the first place. Thus, the Gospels would have to be written early enough to have been authored by true eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and deeds. People who claim the gospel narratives are fictional and filled with errors presume that the authors of the Gospels wrote long after the reported events allegedly occurred and far from the locations they described. If the Gospels are written late, say in the 2nd or 3rd century A.D., then the Gospels are a lie. If someone was going to tell a lie, they would have to tell it late so that the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and deeds would not be able to refute the lie. Since Jesus was crucified in 33 A.D., before anyone can believe the Gospels to be eyewitness accounts, they would have to know that the Gospels were written sometime in the 1st century. The 4 Gospels and Acts fail to mention the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 A.D. that Jesus predicted in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. Then that means that they were all written prior to that memorable event. There is a debate about when John's Gospel was written. Some say it may have occurred after his release from the Isle of Patmos. However, John chapter 5, verse 2 states, quotes, "By the sheep gate in Jerusalem there is a pool," end quotes. This may point to a date before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 A.D. But regarding all the Gospels, we can go a bit further. Neither is the siege of Jerusalem mentioned that occurred in 66 to 70 A.D., nor the death of Paul, who was martyred in the city of Rome in 64 A.D., nor the death of Peter in 65 A.D. Josephus says James died in 62 A.D. These were events that surely would have been reported had they already occurred. So that means Luke and Acts were written before 62 A.D. Now, Acts is usually considered to have been written about 57 to 60 A.D. Second, the gospel narratives were corroborated by archaeology, eyewitnesses, and ancient non-Christian authors like Flavius Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and the Jewish Talmud. Third, we can conclude the Gospels recorded accurate details. The New Testament documents have not changed as we go from the authors of the books of the New Testament to their disciples and from them to their disciples. This is what J. Warner Wallace calls the chain of custody. Fourth, the Gospels were not biased. We discuss Wallace's observation that there are three motives behind any homicide, criminal act, or a lesser moral misbehavior. A, financial greed. B, sexual or relational lust. And C, pursuit of power. Wallace applied these motives to the foremost leader of the early Christian movement, namely to the Apostle Paul. He was not motivated by attempting to gain power. He had that already. The facts are that Paul started off with the authority and respect from his religious community and the leaders of the synagogues in Jerusalem. As a devout religious Jewish leader, he was trusted with the responsibility of hunting down members of the Christian community and pursuing them with a vengeance. Would Paul leave his position of respect and join up with the very group he was charged to destroy, only to suffer persecution for many years so that he might one day return to a position of religious authority and respect? I think not. That is totally implausible. The Apostle Peter, also known as Simon Cephas, from the Aramaic version of his name, he and his brother Andrew were fishermen, and they left that profession and followed Jesus. John Mark uses Peter's eyewitness account as the basis for the Gospel of Mark. Mark was the nephew or cousin of Barnabas. He became so close to Peter that the apostle calls him as my son, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. Mark also may have been the person whose home was the upper room in Mark chapter 14, verse 12, and Acts chapter 12, verse 12 and verse 14. And perhaps he was the unclad lad who fled Gethsemane after Jesus' arrest in Mark chapter 14, verses 51 and 52. Besides these facts about Mark, he was the subject of dispute between Paul and Barnabas and the cause of their split before the second missionary journey. But Paul and Mark later were reconciled, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. If Mark was, say, age 15 at the time of the crucifixion in 33 A.D., and if he lived to 90 years of age, that would be in the year of 108 A.D. We are showing that the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and deeds, especially the authors of the Gospels, were actually there in the first place. Let's start our investigation with the book of Acts. Note, that book gives the history of the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem to Samaria, to Antioch, to the province of Asia, to Ephesus, to Corinth, and eventually to the city of Rome. The Gospel of Luke and Acts are two volumes of a single work by Luke. The Acts story is really not the story of all the apostles, but only 4 of the followers of Christ after the resurrection: Peter, Paul, James, and John. But the latter 2 are barely mentioned. So the book of Acts is more properly designated as the Acts of Peter and Paul. But Peter is practically dropped after the conversion of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. So the last 18 chapters of Acts are all about the activities of Paul. 3 themes underlie the story of the expansion of the early Christian church. A, the Jews' rejection of the gospel. B, the Gentiles' reception. And C, the treatment of the early church by the local people and the Roman officials. The introduction of Acts indicates that Luke's gospel predates the writing of Acts. We must use the remaining circumstantial evidence to try to determine more precisely the time frame. In Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 through 19, and Acts chapter 9, we learn of Paul's encounter with the resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus. Paul went away to Arabia and returned to Damascus. Then 3 years later, Paul went up to Jerusalem and visited Peter, but did not see any of the other apostles except James, the brother of Jesus. Then Galatians chapter 2, verse 1 reveals that after an interval of 14 years, Paul went to Jerusalem along with Barnabas and Titus. So, if Galatians was written in the mid-50s, say in 55 AD, 17 years prior to that would be 38 AD. So Paul saw Peter and James within 5 years of the crucifixion. So Paul's conversion would have occurred sometime between 33 to 38 AD. Paul quoted Luke's gospel in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, and Luke chapter 10, verse 7 in about 63 to 64 AD. Luke's gospel is the only gospel that has Jesus saying that the disciples are to, quotes, do this in remembrance of me, end quotes, regarding the Lord's Supper. Luke chapter 22, verses 19 and 20. Paul quotes it in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 through 25. 1 Corinthians was written sometime in the years 53 to 57 AD. Thus Luke's gospel was written prior to that and is usually dated about 50 to 53 AD. Luke said in his gospel that he was writing an orderly account. That word orderly is interesting because according to Papias, Mark's gospel recorded the testimony of Peter. Papias said Mark's gospel was accurate but was not an orderly account. Peter did not speak in terms of chronological order, but rather in terms of themes. So Mark's gospel, according to Papias, predates Luke's gospel. Luke readily admitted that he was not an eyewitness to the life and ministry of Jesus, but he described himself as an investigator collecting the statements from eyewitnesses who were present at the time. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. As a result, Luke quoted 350 verses from Mark and 250 verses from Matthew. Thus we can conclude that both of the Gospels, Mark and Matthew, were written prior to Luke's Gospel. Even the most skeptical scholars agree that Paul is the author of the letters to the Romans, the Corinthians, and the Galatians. These letters are dated between 48 to 60 AD. Romans, typically dated at 50 AD, reveals that Jesus is the resurrected Son of God. Just 17 years after the resurrection, Jesus was described as divine. He is God incarnate, just as the eyewitnesses described him in the gospel. Jesus treated Scripture as being authoritative and without error. So the reliability of the Bible depends on your view on who you think Jesus really is and on whether you believe what he says is trustworthy. Every religion in the world honors him to some degree. That should incline you toward accepting what he says as trustworthy. Therefore, we can conclude that the documents of the Gospels were written early. Allow me to close this episode by reminding you, exercise daily, walk with God.
Thank you for listening to Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott, a production of Wave 94 Radio in Tallahassee, Florida. If you have any questions or comments for Joe, please forward them to Doug Apple at Wave94 at this email address, dougapple@wave94.com. And be sure to join us every Monday evening at 6:45 p.m. on Wave 94 and subscribe through your favorite podcast app. Defending and Commending the Faith with Joe Mott.